What else are you hearing from the palace tonight about Princess Catherine's condition, not to mention the timing of this announcement?
The grand royal gala was supposed to be a night of polite smiles, shining jewels, and carefully rehearsed family unity. But in just minutes, the whole room shifted. Catherine spotted Camilla wearing Diana's rare tiara, and the Princess of Wales refused to look away. She froze mid-step. Turning slowly toward the Queen Consort, she halted the entire evening with one controlled, devastating gesture. Before we explore what this really means for the family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Heavy silence hit first, and then came the shock. Catherine never raised her voice, she did not rush forward, and she refused to let anger show on her face. She just stood frozen. And that tense silence was more than enough to make the guests nearby realize that something had gone terribly wrong. This glittering royal gala, a highly formal palace event designed to project strength and unity to the world, had suddenly become the public stage for a deep wound that no official speech could ever cover. That diamond tiara was never just a sparkling ornament. It was a sacred piece of royal history passed down through the family. In this heavy moment it carried the living memory of Diana, the quiet pain of William, and the persistent shadow that still followed Harry all the way from across the ocean. William watched Catherine freeze, and the prince's face shifted before anyone could even explain why. He recognized that heavy silence. He knew exactly what it meant. He had spent his entire life learning how to survive inside a monarchy that had once failed his mother, and now her legacy was shining right above Camilla's forehead, as if the painful past could be worn like a cheap accessory without any consequence. Catherine felt that same heavy truth settle deep in her chest. First came the initial shock, then came something much colder. It was not rage, nor was it panic, but a quiet fury, because Diana's name was never a decoration, and her tragic story was not a costume for palace unity. Camilla tried to keep moving. She lifted her chin, forced a tight smile, and acted as though the night could still be saved by sheer willpower. But her own hand betrayed her. For one fleeting second, the Queen Consort reached up to touch the tiara, almost as if she were checking to see if it was still there. Almost as if she already understood that the jewel had become incredibly dangerous. That single small gesture spoke far louder than any confession. She knew the entire room had noticed. She knew Catherine had seen it, and she recognized that William was staring at the exact same thing. Charles felt the heavy silence spread before the guests even fully understood what was happening. The king turned toward an aide and whispered a low instruction to hold the formal announcement. This was the planned public speech that was supposed to mark the official purpose of the gala. He did not explain his decision. He did not have to. The monarch could clearly see Catherine moving forward, now taking one slow, deliberate step closer to Camilla, while William stood right beside her like a protective wall of quiet, controlled grief. As the aide stepped back, the program halted, and every polite smile in that room began to crumble. Catherine stepped closer, calm enough to terrify them all. She did not look defeated. Instead, she looked entirely resolved. Camilla held her position, but the Queen Consort's face visibly tightened as the space between them quickly vanished. Charles watched the tense moment slip completely beyond royal protocol. William watched his wife carry a heavy emotional burden that his own heart could barely hold. And as the live music faded into the background, the true clash was no longer just about a diamond tiara. It was about who actually held the right to carry Diana's legacy. Before a single word was uttered, all four of them understood that this evening had turned into something far more dangerous than a mere public embarrassment. Catherine stood wounded but remarkably steady. William looked torn between his royal duty and his mother's memory. Camilla held her ground with clear, visible strain. Charles carried the immense weight of a monarch who knew that this one jewel had just reopened every single scar the royal palace had spent decades trying to bury. Catherine could feel the walls of the room closing in, yet she refused to step back. She had walked in as the Princess of Wales, a title belonging to the wife of the heir to the throne. But in this tense moment, the title meant so much more than mere rank. It meant standing firmly beside William, sharing the crushing weight of Diana's memory, and actively protecting a legacy that still lived inside the family's deepest unhealed wound. Though she was not Diana's biological daughter, Catherine had become the woman closest to the grieving son who still carried that pain with him every single day. William stared at the glittering tiara as if time had suddenly folded in on itself. The prince had spent his entire life learning how to smile through painful questions about his mother, how to serve a crown that had once made her feel so lonely, and how to keep his deep grief locked safely behind royal duty. Diana's rare tiara was never just a simple piece of jewellery to him. It was intimately tied to a woman the entire world loved, a mother he lost far too young, and a tragic story the royal palace had never managed to fully escape. Camilla immediately knew the temperature in the room had shifted. The queen consort could feel it in the heavy silence, and in the sharp way Catherine's face hardened, in the way William stopped acting like a senior royal and suddenly started looking like an angry son. What she had chosen for elegance now felt like a direct, deliberate provocation. What she might have believed was simple continuity now looked like a hostile intrusion. Her shoulders remained firm, but her eyes darted around too quickly, searching for some form of rescue that simply did not come. Charles leaned close toward William and quietly urged him to stay calm. The king's voice was low, incredibly careful, almost pleading, because he fully understood the massive danger of a single wrong word. A monarch is the reigning head of both the royal family and the entire state, but even that supreme power could not erase a grieving son's deep pain. William did not offer an answer. He only stared directly at his father, and that single look carried decades of disappointment, complex loyalty, and unresolved grief. In that one brutal moment of silence, Sophie noticed Catherine's breathing change before anyone else in the room did. The trusted confidant stepped closer, not to interrupt or speak over her, but to stand near enough so Catherine knew she was not standing alone. Sophie fully understood the danger of this fragile moment, because deep family wounds inside the British monarchy never stayed private for very long. A single tremor could easily trigger a massive national storm. One controversial jewel could quickly become a final verdict. Camilla finally turned her head toward Catherine and asked in a very low voice whether they should go on with the evening. The queen consort tried to make her question sound practical and gentle, but it landed with heavy pressure. Catherine looked directly at her, then glanced at William, and then looked back again. Her response was incredibly quiet, but it sliced cleanly through every polished excuse in that room. No, they absolutely could not continue as if nothing had happened. That quiet refusal changed everything. Catherine was not acting out for attention. She was simply refusing to take part in a fake performance. William stood firmly beside her, looking much steadier now because she had spoken the exact truth. He could barely voice himself. Charles looked from his wife to his son and realized the gala had slipped completely out of control. But the icy silence in that room had not actually started on this night. It had been quietly building for weeks, just waiting for one reckless decision to finally ignite it. The real beginning was not this dramatic gala. It was a private jewellery fitting 3 weeks ago when Camilla stood before a locked velvet case and chose the single piece everyone believed would always remain untouched. She was not there, but her absence made that choice feel even sharper. By the time the tiara left the vault, the point of no return had already passed. Camilla had entered that private fitting fully expecting to dictate the terms. The royal jewellery vault, that heavily fortified palace room where historic family heirlooms are kept ready for state banquets, was supposed to offer quiet options, not trigger a full-blown family crisis. Charles had already signed off on a wide array of gala jewellery, meaning the queen consort could easily pick from several classic pieces deemed safe for public display. But he never expected her to reach for Diana's rare headpiece. He never imagined that this single deliberate choice would turn their celebration into a brutal family reckoning. An aide watched Camilla's hand move toward the glass case, feeling the sharp danger before anyone even spoke. The aide issued a careful, quiet warning. That tiara carried far too much emotional weight, bound to Diana, to William, and to a pain, still very much alive. Camilla listened, but she did not step away. The Queen Consort genuinely believed wearing the jewel would project a sense of continuity, signalling that the monarchy could simply absorb the past and move on. But the aide knew some memories refused to be buried. Some memories fight back. Sophie soon learned the truth through a private written report from that very same aide. 2 days later, the trusted confidant read the message, once then read it again, instantly understanding why this mattered so much. It was never about the sparkle. This was about timing deep grief and the unspoken rules families quietly make when official protocols fail. Sophie knew Catherine would never view this tiara as just some innocent fashion choice. She would see it as a line crossed right in front of the one man who had carried Diana's loss since boyhood. Catherine felt the quiet sadness land long before any anger could take over. When Sophie told her about the fitting during a private chat, Catherine did not explode. She just went entirely silent. That silence was far worse because the princess knew exactly what a public scene would trigger before the gala even started. If she challenged Camilla too early, the palace would just dismiss it as petty tension. But if she stayed silent, William would face that old pain alone. So Catherine chose tight restraint, hoping dignity could survive where formal protocol had failed to protect them. William grew visibly unsettled the second Catherine mentioned the tiara. The prince asked if Charles actually knew, and that question carried a lot more than simple curiosity. It carried a son's deep fear that his mother's memory was once again being cast aside for royal convenience. Catherine simply could not give him any real certainty. She could only share what Sophie had uncovered and what the anxious aide had warned. William looked away, and in that heavy silence, she knew he was already slipping back into that familiar old ache. Charles believed he had successfully managed the gala before it even began. The king trusted that approved jewels, careful seating, and highly polished order would hold the night together. But a monarchy is not held together by schedules alone. It is bound by shared meaning. Camilla believed the tiara would help her stand tall as queen consort with genuine confidence. Instead, the glittering piece became a painful reminder that history does not simply bow just because the reigning crown demands it. Catherine decided to attend anyway. She would not arrive looking wounded, and she would not give the nervous palace a full crisis before the very first greeting. She would stand tall beside William, look Camilla in the eye, and trust that quiet dignity would be enough. But that hope shattered the very moment Camilla swept into the room, wearing the precise symbol Catherine had prayed would stay locked away. No loud shouting was necessary, no public accusations even had to be voiced. Catherine simply stepped toward Camilla, and the space between them instantly became the most dangerous spot in the room. Guests went silent. William moved closer. Charles looked suddenly older. The queen consort defiantly lifted her chin. But the confidence she tried to project could not mask the sudden fear in her eyes. Catherine stared directly at Camilla, asking one single question that sliced straight through every polished excuse. "Why this tiara? Why tonight?" Her voice stayed low, but everyone in the room felt the immense force behind it. The Princess of Wales was not speaking as a rival hungry for cheap drama. She was speaking as the woman standing fiercely beside William Diana's son, right in front of a historic jewel that carried far too much grief to ever be treated like mere decoration. Camilla answered with practiced control but absolutely no comfort. The Queen Consort coolly stated that the piece belonged entirely to the Crown, a royal collection of history titles and symbols held for the institution, rather than any single private person. On paper, that explanation might have actually worked. It might have worked in a formal palace briefing, but Catherine refused to let it pass. She told her that not everything owned by the crown is free from pain, and some historic pieces cannot be worn without reopening a deep wound. William stood beside Catherine, fighting hard to stay still. The prince heard his mother's memory being folded into dry protocol, and every word seemed to tighten a knot inside him. He had spent his whole life learning the language of duty. He knew when to speak, when to wait, and when to swallow bitter hurt for the sake of the crown. But this was different. Diana's memory was never a rule book. It was his childhood. It was loss. It was the only part of him no crown could command. Charles moved in quickly, hoping one careful sentence might save the entire room from collapsing. The king tried to soften the moment, telling them the evening could still continue if everyone would just remain calm. But his voice simply did not carry the authority it should have. He knew the emotional truth was not on Camilla's side, and he could see that clearly written in William's face. He could hear it in Catherine's cold restraint, and he knew that forcing this gala forward would not protect the monarchy at all. It would only serve to publicly humiliate his own son. Camilla did not break, but her body betrayed her. Her hand rose slightly toward the tiara, then froze. A tiny tremble passed through her fingers, too quick for guests to catch, but impossible for Catherine to ignore. The queen consort had desperately tried to wrap herself in royal authority, yet for one sharp second she looked less like a woman defending a historic jewel, and far more like someone realizing she had completely misjudged the cost. Catherine refused to drop it, telling Charles the gala could not go on until they settled this privately. The palace programme, the highly anticipated schedule of speeches, and the ceremonial moments suddenly meant nothing beside the heavy pain now occupying the centre of the room. William stood right beside her, completely silent but firm. Camilla looked from Catherine to the king, silently begging him to restore some order, but control had already slipped far away. Charles finally realized that delaying the confrontation was no longer possible. The king turned to the nearest aide and ordered the doors to the side chamber opened at once. That side chamber, a private secure room reserved for sensitive royal matters, away from prying eyes, became the only place left to resolve a confrontation far too dangerous to continue in public. Catherine walked forward first. William kept pace behind. Camilla maintained that rigid, high-chinned posture, but her silent facade was cracking. The crowd stayed back, yet the heavy fallout followed them inside. Charles slipped inside last, carrying the grim realization that this gala was now a direct trial of loyalty, memory, and power. Once those doors clicked shut, the gossip about Camilla's dress faded. The real fight was about who controlled the legacy of Princess Diana, and inside that quiet chamber the royal glamour completely evaporated. No smiles remained, no music, no stiff protocol to shield them. Charles stood trapped between his wife, his son, and the woman who had just derailed the monarchy's most polished night. Then the king did the unthinkable. He stopped worrying about the rigid schedule and simply stared at the raw, heavy pain written across William's face. Charles recognized the threat had transformed. This was no longer just about salvaging a fancy event. It was about protecting whatever trust remained inside a family scarred by decades of deep wounds. The strict ceremonial sequence, the tight schedule of royal speeches, greetings, and perfectly timed formal moments was designed to project absolute control. Yet that control was worthless when the key players at the core of the crown looked utterly shattered right before their own guests. William spoke up before the king could ease the tension. The prince made it clear that Diana's legacy was not some cheap decoration to be paraded, while her sons stood right there. His voice stayed low, but each word hummed with a lifetime of painful restraint. This was not a call for revenge, he was simply demanding respect. Catherine stood firm by his side, poised and quiet, yet her silence sent a sharp message. There would be absolutely no apologies from her for disrupting the gala. Camilla felt the room shrinking. The Queen Consort argued that wearing the tiara was merely about her rank, not a deliberate insult to Diana or her grieving sons. She quickly reminded Charles that she had played her designated part, and that the historic jewel was ultimately property of the Crown. But the Crown, the institution and its vault of treasures, could not shield her from the emotional reality of her choice. An heirloom might be legally hers to wear, but displaying it was still deeply cruel. Sophie stepped into the fray quietly. As a trusted family confidant, she spoke without anger, offering Charles the harsh truth that no palace aide dared to whisper. She reminded the king that royal symbols can bring healing when treated gently or cause deep humiliation when paraded without any real empathy. Catherine glanced at Sophie, feeling a surge of relief that she was not isolated. William heard those supportive words and finally exhaled, grateful that someone had named the pain out loud. Charles stared down at the official brief in his hand. He had clutched that paper like a shield, a neat list of scripted talking points and protocol. Then he quietly set it aside. That simple gesture shifted everything. The royal schedule had lost, and the family's pain had won. He announced that this gala would not go on as planned until they resolved the tiara standoff. Camilla stared back, utterly shocked by his sudden turn. The Queen Consort had fully expected her husband to defend the event, and, more importantly, to defend her. Instead, he looked from William to Catherine. He realized that forcing them back into the ballroom without addressing this would make the entire monarchy look heartless blind and deeply out of touch. The king was not turning his back on his wife. He was simply trying to stop a private crisis from exploding into a massive public disaster. Catherine stayed perfectly composed, yet the sheer weight of her quiet resolve dominated the room. There was no shouting, no dramatic bids for attention. She had simply refused to allow Diana's legacy to be treated as some shiny prop for fake royal unity. William stood tall beside her, his quiet posture shifting from raw hurt to total solidarity. Charles saw this, and his choice became inevitable. The king turned to Camilla and quietly requested that she take off the tiara before they stepped back outside. The words were spoken softly, yet they struck like a final royal sentence. Camilla remained silent. Her features hardened as her pride wrestled with sudden panic. Catherine looked away while William kept his eyes cast down. But taking off the jewels did not heal the damage. It only made the crisis impossible to hide. The moment Camilla stepped back in, everyone noticed. The tiara was gone. No explanations were offered, it was simply missing. And sometimes that kind of quiet absence speaks louder than any scandal. Catherine stood close to William, her face a mask of quiet determination. Nearby, Charles bore the weight of a choice that saved Diana's legacy, but left his wife deeply embarrassed in front of their entire social circle. Camilla re-entered the room with her head held high, but every single guest was staring at what was missing. The Queen Consort was no longer wearing Diana's signature tiara, and that sudden change hit the crowd harder than any announcement. A tiara is a priceless jeweled headpiece reserved for grand royal moments. But this piece had become far heavier than mere ceremony. It stood as absolute proof that Catherine's stand was heard, that William's pain mattered, and that Charles had prioritized family over polished tradition. Yet Catherine felt no sense of victory. She stood by William, feeling only a deep sadness. The moment had exposed just how fragile royal unity is when old wounds are reopened. The Princess of Wales never wanted Camilla to be humiliated. She simply wanted Diana's memory protected. But to the whispering crowd, the subtle distinction was completely lost at first. The guests only saw the empty space, the thick tension, and a queen consort returning, stripped of the jewel that had defined her entrance. William leaned in close and quietly thanked his wife. His voice carried deep gratitude, but also immense pain. He knew what it had cost her to stand so firm. He had watched his late mother's memory get dragged right back into the swamp of palace politics, and he had witnessed his wife refuse to let that legacy be reduced to a cheap decorative prop. Catherine heard the deep ache beneath his words. She did not offer a quick reply, but simply stayed close, holding enough quiet strength for both of them. Camilla sat by herself for several long minutes, and the sudden isolation in that crowded room felt cruel. The Queen Consort could practically hear the whispers, even though no one dared speak aloud. She had arrived that evening believing the tiara would solidify her high status. Now its sudden removal made her look publicly disciplined before the very aristocrats she had hoped to impress. Her pride remained, but humiliation pushed back. Every quiet glance felt like judgment. Every silent pause felt like blame. Charles restarted the gala, but not as planned. The king ordered the entire evening cut short. He immediately ordered the evening to be shortened, scrapping the formal tribute prepared earlier, meaning that planned public moment of praise and remembrance during the ceremony was completely abandoned. The monarch had managed to save the room from an open shouting match, but he couldn't shield them from the raw truth. This celebration now carried the heavy weight of desperate damage control. Watching Camilla from across the room, Sophie understood this loss was far more than just a public embarrassment. Sophie saw it clearly. Camilla had lost far more than just a sparkling ornament. She had lost her absolute certainty. Protocol no longer offered its easy, comforting shield. Sophie watched Catherine closely, knowing the princess had not acted from malice. She acted because some symbols become too painful on the wrong head. William finally turned and walked away from the room. He did not storm out. Still, that quiet movement caught Catherine's attention. She followed him. She knew his heavy silence too well. Charles watched them leave. He stared down as the night's heavy weight turned deeply personal. Camilla remained seated, surrounded by attention, yet completely alone. Outside the roaring gala, the empty corridor became the only place where grief could breathe. Catherine caught up with William before he hid it. He stopped short. He did not speak. She stood close enough to remind him he did not have to bear Diana's memory alone. Far from the chandeliers and polite faces, they finally said what the palace had avoided for decades. In the hallway, the gala noise became distant, almost unreal. William stood with one hand against the wall. He was fighting the memories that had followed him since childhood. Catherine did not rush him. She simply stayed right beside him. For once, there were no royal advisers standing between their pain and the truth. William finally spoke. The words came out heavier than anger. Seeing the tiara on Camilla felt like watching Diana's memory being rewritten in real time. Not honoured, not protected, just rewritten. The prince had carried his mother's loss through every public smile, every duty, and every carefully managed anniversary. But tonight forced that private pain into the open, into a crowded room where everyone pretended not to see it. Catherine listened without interrupting. She knew this mattered because Diana was not just a former Princess of Wales, a title given to the heir's wife. She was William's mother, the woman whose sudden absence shaped his youth and whose lasting memory still shapes public feeling toward the monarchy. Catherine knew the tiara mattered. Inside, the palace symbols are never just historical objects. They show the public who is respected, who is replaced, and who is expected to stay silent. William looked away, wondering if he should have spoken up first. William wondered if Catherine had taken on a risk that should have been his. The prince's quiet guilt ran incredibly deep. He had stood frozen between duty and grief. She had stepped forward and done what the palace feared most, making the pain visible. Catherine reached out with calm strength. She told William that keeping silent would have felt like a betrayal. She could not let him face that memory alone. Catherine did not say this with pride. Her voice was heavy with sadness because she understood the real cost. If she stayed quiet, Diana's legacy would be used for empty royal ceremony. If she spoke, the monarchy would fracture in public. Either way, someone had to bleed. William took Catherine's hand. That small gesture said what no speech could. He was not thanking her as a royal. He was thanking her as a son, a husband, a man who had spent far too long hiding his pain behind perfect manners. Catherine held his hand firmly, reminding him that protecting Diana's dignity was not his burden alone. It was theirs now. Charles appeared in the doorway and stopped. Charles saw his son and daughter-in-law standing together. They were not performing duty, they were two people facing a wound the palace had avoided for decades. He did not interrupt. He did not command. He simply watched, and the silence seemed to humble him, understanding that royal power could pause a gala, but only love had stopped it. William turned back toward the room with a different strength. William was still hurt, but he was no longer alone inside that hurt. Catherine stood right beside him, steady and unshaken. Charles remained at the entrance, knowing something had shifted far beyond his control. When William returned to the gala, he was no longer a wounded son hiding his pain. He returned beside Catherine as a future king who had chosen where he stood. By morning, the private wound became a public earthquake, and the world began to judge. The next morning, Britain did not wake up to some quiet minor palace correction. Instead, they woke to a single image that told the whole story. Catherine standing still, Camilla bareheaded, William pale, and Charles trapped between love and duty. The monarchy had survived wars and scandals, but this front page made one question impossible to ignore. Catherine saw the headline before breakfast, and the weight of it hit her immediately. The London Herald ran the photo across its front page with 6 words that struck like a bell. Diana's shadow stops the gala. A front page is where editors place the story they believe will define the day. This particular cover did not just define a single day. It defined the wound the palace had spent decades trying to hide. William read it beside Catherine and said nothing for a long moment. William looked at the image of Camilla without her tiara, then at his wife, standing firm beside him. He knew the public would grasp this symbol faster than the palace. Diana's memory did not belong only inside royal walls. It lived in people who remembered her pain, her warmth, and the way she was loved beyond ceremony. Camilla felt the sting of judgment before anyone spoke to her. Watching the news replay that single image again and again, Camilla saw the missing tiara framed as a public rebuke rather than a private correction. She had believed taking the jewel off would control the night. Instead, the absence became the story. Her silence became the story. Catherine's stillness became the story. Charles ordered a brief statement before the pressure grew. Charles approved the palace statement, carefully confirming that the gala program had been adjusted out of respect for family sensitivities. A palace statement is an official message meant to calm a royal matter, but this one could not truly quiet the storm. It admitted enough to confirm the bitter tension, but not enough to fix the damage. Charles knew every single word would be picked apart. Crowds quickly gathered outside Kensington Palace with white roses and handwritten cards praising Catherine's choice. Their royal home became the spot where public feelings turned deeply personal. People did not gather there just to trade cheap gossip. They came because they felt Catherine defended something truly tender. One card read simply, "Thank you for remembering her." William heard about the note and looked away, moved far more than he wanted to show. Catherine felt deeply overwhelmed by the reaction. She had not halted the gala to become a symbol, yet her quiet mourning had somehow become a nationwide stand. The princess understood the inherent danger in all of this. Public praise might offer comfort, but it could easily deepen the bitter split inside the family. Still, she could not deny what the public had witnessed. They had seen a woman refuse to let Diana's memory be polished for royal convenience. A commentator broke the heavy mood on live television with a line that spread like wildfire. Last night was not about the jewels. It was about memory respect and the future queen drawing a firm line. Those words struck Camilla hard because they clearly named Catherine as the moral centre of the whole story. They struck Charles even harder because they suggested the palace only followed after his daughter-in-law acted first. The public sided heavily with Catherine, and the palace had no choice but to accept that reality. Camilla remained isolated, Charles stayed incredibly careful, and William stood quietly grateful beside the very woman who had carried his deepest pain into the open light. Formal hierarchy had completely lost its grip. For one brutal day, emotional truth had actually won. When all the noise finally settled, only one verdict remained, not from the newspapers, but from the very heart of the monarchy. In the end, the night was not remembered for the gala, the guest list, or the speeches that never happened. It was remembered for one brief pause. Catherine stopped. Camilla stood exposed. William faced the raw ache of his mother's memory, while Charles learned that a crown can command grand ceremony, but it can never command love. That was the one verdict no palace statement could ever soften. Catherine's quiet action became the defining moment because she chose emotional truth over a polished royal performance. The Princess of Wales had not raised her voice, had not chased easy applause, and had not tried to destroy Camilla in front of the room. She simply refused to let Diana's memory become part of their polished show. That mattered because royal life completely depends on symbols. And when a symbol is handled carelessly, it can wound far deeper than words. William found some measure of peace in that quiet truth. The prince had watched Catherine defend his mother's dignity without turning the moment into an act of revenge. For him, Diana's memory always carried love and pain. It was not just history, it was childhood grief and the empty space no ceremony could fill. So when Catherine stood firm, he did not see some act of rebellion. He saw protection. He saw someone finally guarding the vulnerable part of him the palace had too often asked him to hide. Camilla accepted the boundary in private. Even if her pride made acceptance painful, the queen consort understood that wearing that tiara had crossed a line the family was simply not ready to forgive. A tiara is a jewelled headpiece worn for royal occasions, but this one had become far more than a royal object. She had honestly believed the crown could carry this piece forward. Instead, the jewelled piece carried the heavy past right back into the room. Charles recognised the lesson later when all the noise had faded and the formal words no longer mattered. The king understood that monarchy survives not by controlling symbols, but by deeply respecting what those symbols mean to real people. Monarchy is a system where a king represents the nation through duty ceremony and the weight of inherited responsibility. But ceremony without feeling becomes cold. Responsibility without genuine care becomes dangerous. Charles had seen that truth on William's face, and he could not unsee it. Sophie told Catherine the simplest version of what everyone else was too afraid to say. The trusted confidant said the room changed because someone finally refused to pretend pain was protocol. Protocol means the official rules and customs guiding royal behaviour. But no rule could ever erase what Diana meant to her sons or to the public. Catherine listened quietly as the words settled in her heart, having never wanted to become the centre of the night. She only wanted the truth to have some place in it. Meanwhile, Camilla remained alone with the bitter cost of her choice. The queen consort had lost far more than the right to wear one specific jewel that evening. She had lost the lazy assumption that royal rank could protect her from emotional consequences. Catherine had not humiliated her for sport, but the wound was real. William did not attack her, but his silence judged her. Charles had not abandoned her, but his final decision had revealed exactly where the moral weight of the room truly rested. The tiara was quietly returned to the vault with a new private restriction. The Royal Jewellery Vault, the secure place where historic family jewels are stored, now held more than diamonds. It held a warning the piece would not be worn again without family agreement. This was not because the crown feared scandal, but because the family had finally admitted that some objects carry deep living pain. Diana's memory had been protected not by a grand speech, but by a firm boundary. Catherine did not halt the gala just to shame Camilla. She halted it to protect Diana's memory, steady William's aching heart, and remind the monarchy that some legacies are too sacred to be staged. Charles learned that authority has limits. Camilla learned the hard way that history does not bend to ambition. William learned that he did not have to carry his heavy grief completely alone. And Catherine, became the woman who stood still long enough for the whole crown to understand what it had almost forgotten. The gala ended, the heavy doors closed, and the crown moved forward, quieter, humbler, and forever changed by that single night. Catherine simply refused to look away, choosing instead to stand her ground and quietly alter the course of the entire monarchy.